Hello, I'm Dr. Sam, this is Dr. Sam's Health, and today we're going to talk about COVID-19 again. In my previous video, when I was talking about certain statistical myths and memes related to COVID-19, about survival rates, about mortality rates, I promised that I would talk about this medication, hydroxychloroquine, highly politicized drug, and today I'm going to fulfill my promise and talk about this medication in detail. But prior to doing so, I would like to make a couple of disclaimers. First of all, I'm a practicing physician, a medical doctor, but it doesn't mean that anything I say in my YouTube channel, on my blog, drsamshealth.com, is a medical advice. Please don't take anything that I say here or on my blog as a medical advice. It is merely my opinion, and my opinion doesn't necessarily coincide or represent the opinion of my regulatory bodies, my colleges, my universities, or my profession in general. And in addition to my usual disclaimer, I'm a psychiatrist. I do not normally prescribe hydroxychloroquine. I know about this drug because I went to medical school, I studied it as a part of my pharmacology course, I prepared for my license exams and so on, but it's been a while, so I'm a bit rusty in this department, and I had to do my own research on this medication just because I have heard a lot about it from my colleagues and from mass media. President Trump was heavily promoting it. So this topic became very polarized, very politicized, and my goal for today's video is to review the evidence related to this medication and its use for COVID-19, whether it's helpful or not. And I will do my best to be objective, so bear with me, I've got lots of information prepared. And speaking of large volumes of information, I do have a lot of stuff to talk about, but I wouldn't like this video to be very lengthy. So I posted most of my findings on my blog at drsamshealth.com. We've got all the references there, all the data, all the numbers. Here I will just go over the, kind of groups of evidence that is either supporting hydroxychloroquine or not. And one little remark, sometimes I tend to say hydroxyquinolone. I don't know why, but I tend to make this mistake, so if I do so, please forgive me. Anyhow, let's dive in, let's talk about the medication itself. The very first thing I would like you to know about this medication is that it's a very old drug that has been used for decades to treat malaria. It's an anti-malarian medication, but also it has been used to treat lupus, like some autoinflammatory diseases, and as far as I know, a lot of tropical medicine specialists were trying to use hydroxychloroquine for treatment of not only malaria, but also like Ebola, different other coronaviruses. We'll talk about this. And that is why some of them decided to try it for the novel coronavirus, COVID-19. One of the key players there would be, I guess, Dr. Didier Raoult from France, who started treating his patients with hydroxychloroquine, and he reported pretty good results. What I could find is some sort of a report that he had published with 20 patients in Marseille who received hydroxychloroquine with azithromycin, and also he had 16 patients who did not receive neither hydroxychloroquine or azithromycin, in some other sites. It already sounds like a very oddly designed experiment, but I must say it was not an experiment. It was a naturalistic clinical trial when they just gave this medication to a group of patients, the convenience sample, 20 patients. By the way, very small number of participants. I'm actually a little bit disappointed because he had all the opportunities to give it to, I don't know, dozens of patients, not to just 20. Anyhow, he had reported, and it's a published report, I've got the reference on my blog, that patients who received hydroxychloroquine, especially in combination with azithromycin, did significantly better than those who did not receive these medications. The main endpoint of this study was viral clearance, or they were testing patients for virions on day 6 of the treatment regimen, and they have shown that 75% of those who received hydroxychloroquine were virologically cured, compared to just 12.5% in the pseudo-control group. And 100% of people who received hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin were also virologically cured. So it was a fantastic result. Again, I have a couple of things to say about this study, specifically that it was a study with a small sample. They were not reporting any clinical outcomes, meaning did these patients do better or worse, what were the fatality rates and so on. And quite frankly, there was no point in researching this or reporting this because the sample size was very small. And again, I believe that this kind of studies should be done on much larger scale, but in a way, this study was revolutionary because though it was heavily criticized, it was one of the first trials of this treatment regimen that was supposed to help this terrible condition, right? So all the kudos to Dr. Didier Raoul, and unfortunately his study was heavily criticized, and we would like to have something better than that. And we got more data with the studies of Dr. Vladimir Zelenko from New York. I actually honestly thought that he was Russian, and he did something similar to Dr. Raoul. What he did is he prescribed hydroxychloroquine, azithromycin, and zinc to a relatively large cohort of his patients. To my knowledge, it was 141 COVID-19 patients, and he had some sort of a control group of 377 untreated patients. He had demonstrated that in this non-randomized, not blinded sample, relatively large, they got much better results in terms of mortality and in terms of hospitalization. People who were receiving the combination of drugs did significantly better than those who did not. I don't want to get into details. The reason for that is, first of all, I have got all these details on my blog, but also I cannot even say that this study was published. To be honest, it was published as a preprint on some website called preprints.org. It's a little bit messy. In my opinion, it's hard to understand what happened to all these people, what kind of research methods were used, and in general, we've got much better sources of information. But one important thing I would like to say is that that study was very important too. In general, this kind of observational studies, they show us that there is some signal, that we use certain protocol, we try it on a group of volunteers and group of patients, and we see certain results. And then we have to devise a proper studies. More on this just in a couple of minutes, but right now I would like to mention the third observational study that came from Wuhan, China, the place where it's all started. They treated 550 patients with severe form of COVID-19, and 48 out of these 550 patients received hydroxychloroquine. They reported pretty high fatality rate among those who received hydroxychloroquine, 18.8%, which was still 3 times less than the fatality rate in the essentially control group, which was close to 50%. So that was the third observational study of hydroxychloroquine that also showed some good potential for this medication to be used in COVID-19. At this point, some of you might ask, what else do you need, Dr. Sam? You've got 3 clinical trials that are showing that this medication is helpful. It has huge potential. We should give it to everybody. Well, first of all, these were not clinical trials. And the second, these were observational studies, and observational studies have lots of flaws. To make a long story very short, I will say the following. The clinical outcome of using a medication, hydroxychloroquine in this case, is a function of multiple factors. These factors are individual patient characteristics, age, sex, their obesity status, their concurrent medical conditions, medications that they are taking, the environmental factors such as the treatment regimen, the level of, sanitation, the temperature in their rooms, how much follow-up they received, if they were on ventilators or not, number of other things. I can make this list pretty much endless. And all these things might have played a role in achieving better recovery rate than just hydroxychloroquine. So in order to isolate it, we need to randomly assign patients to either placebo or to a medication, hydroxychloroquine in this case. So in order to show that hydroxychloroquine is the factor that is responsible for recovery of these patients, we need to run a randomized controlled trial. preferably in multiple centers with large number of subjects, and preferably double-blind placebo-controlled one. And you can believe in all kinds of conspiracy theories. You can blame government for anything you want. You can say that CDC is bad, that Big Pharma is bad. But I must say that WHO, CDC, NIH, all these organizations, they came together and they actually did run several randomized controlled trials. And we'll talk about them in a second. But prior to that, I would like to talk about one particular study that is just bugging me big time. You see, there was one great study that was published in 2005, and the title of the study was "Chloroquine is a potent inhibitor of SARS coronavirus infection and spread." And here's the thing about this study. For some reason, a lot of people keep quoting this study and saying that, 15 years ago, Fauci and his cronies or whoever knew that hydroxychloroquine is helpful for coronavirus. It can prevent it and it can cure COVID-19, which could not be farther from the truth. First of all, they were not studying hydroxychloroquine, they were studying chloroquine. Second, I don't think that Dr. Fauci has anything to do with this study. Third, this study was not a clinical trial of any sort. It was a study that was performed in a culture of cells, and they were studying the spread of, attention, another coronavirus. It was a different coronavirus. This study was done 15 years ago, even prior to that. It was reported 15 years ago. And this novel coronavirus was not known then. So it's just logically impossible to even envision how in 2005 people could have published something about the virus that is about to break out 15 years later in 2020. Quite frankly, this meme was intellectually offensive. And to anybody who is kind of spreading this meme or myth or this infographic about this study, please check your facts and compare them. If something was done 15 years ago when this virus was not even like in the picture, it's highly unlikely that it is related to modern pandemic in any way. Actually, I can see how people who likely were aware of this study thought that if chloroquine slowed down the spread of another coronavirus in cell culture, maybe hydroxychloroquine can be helpful clinically for treatment of COVID-19, just because there are some similarities between these viruses. But that's pretty much it. So now let's get to the clinical trials. And we actually have at least 3 major clinical trials that we can talk about, the true RCTs. Again, I don't want to get into too much details because we can talk for at least half an hour about each study. So the very important study was something that was called ORCID trial, when they started treating patients with hydroxychloroquine, and when they reached approximately, they were close to 500 enrolled patients, they stopped this study. The reason for that was not adverse effects, but simply every time you run a big clinical trial, there are lots of risks associated with these trials, including risks for participants. When you're running this trial, you usually do something that we call an interim analysis. You just take the data that you already have from the portion of participants, you analyze the data, and you come to certain conclusions in terms of whether you want to continue this trial or not. And in their case, their Data Safety and Monitoring Board, the SNB, they came to a conclusion that so far there was no observed benefit from the use of hydroxychloroquine, and they decided to terminate the trial because continuing an effective trial would be unethical and cost ineffective. I know that some people will say, oh, it's Big Pharma or some sort of a New World Order organization that halted this study. No, actually, that's not the only study that was conducted, and it didn't make sense to continue having the results that they were receiving. Honestly, I would like to see the results because I could not find them, but apparently it was not effective. And they also indicated that the administration of hydroxychloroquine was not associated with any significant adverse effects, which is a nice finding too. Also, on my website, on my blog, there will be a link to the actual clinical trial identifier. You can check it out for yourself. But quite frankly, I don't want you to waste your time with that trial because we had another one, actually a much larger clinical trial called Recovery. Also on my website, on my blog, I'll have a link to that trial too. They have treated 1,500 patients with hydroxychloroquine, and they had over 3,000 patients who were in control group. The main endpoint of this large trial was 28-day mortality rate, and the trial with a large number of participants, randomized, clearly showed that there is no effect from hydroxychloroquine. The mortality rate in the hydroxychloroquine group was 26.8%, the mortality rate in the control group was 25%, which is statistically identical. So the study of such a large scale clearly shows that the use of hydroxychloroquine is not really helpful for patients with COVID-19. There are multiple other studies. I know of at least one that was done in Catalonia, smaller scale, also randomized controlled trial, similar design, similar outcomes. No improvement with hydroxychloroquine compared to placebo. Some of you might ask a question, what about prevention? Because some people were advocating for using hydroxychloroquine really en masse, widely, to prevent the COVID-19 among those who were exposed. Luckily, there was a randomized controlled trial conducted in Canada. I'm very proud of it. A multi-center study conducted in several provinces. They have taken 800 patients who were exposed to COVID-19 through personal contacts, and they have randomized them into two groups. One of them, 414 patients, received hydroxychloroquine, and 407 patients received placebo. And they have indicated that patients receiving hydroxychloroquine were not less likely to develop COVID-19 compared to those who received placebo. So this is a hard research evidence of hydroxychloroquine not being helpful for neither treatment of COVID-19 nor prevention of COVID-19. Also in this Canadian study, they have shown that patients receiving hydroxychloroquine had quite a few adverse effects, much higher number than those who were receiving placebo. So that pretty much tells us that we shouldn't use hydroxychloroquine preemptively, because we know that it doesn't really help, but the side effects are much more pronounced. Nothing serious, by the way, but you don't want to complicate the situation even further. So having said that, what would be my final conclusion based on everything I have just reviewed and said? Hydroxychloroquine seemed to be a promising medication and pharmacological agent that could be used for treatment or prevention of COVID-19. There were several observational studies, naturalistic experiments that have shown some promise. But at the same time, when they started conducting the properly designed randomized controlled trials, they have shown that these observational studies, they did not hold. In general, hydroxychloroquine doesn't really help, neither with prevention nor with treatment of COVID-19, and it should not be used. And I find it to be very unfortunate because it pretty much means that this one medication, one hope that we had, is not actually valid, and we have to continue researching other agents, other medications, vaccines, you name it, but we have to pursue other routes. And hydroxychloroquine is a dead end. Once again, I'm not happy about it, but that's the reality that we live in. So that was everything I wanted to say about hydroxychloroquine. To be honest, I'm a bit tired of this COVID-19 topics, but I still feel obliged to talk about them because there is a lot of, again, misinformation about this pandemic, about COVID-19, and we want everybody to know the truth and to be properly informed. So please interact with me, ask me your questions, leave comments, hit the like button, subscribe button, the notification bell, check out my website, drsamshealth.com. I've got my blog there with all the information, all the numbers, figures, links, references to the research articles I was talking about here today. And I'm pretty much done here today. So I will see you in my next video. All the best.